Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 5th webinar of our Ucits series, which is dedicated today to the famous topic cost and fees, in particular in Ucits, but we'll talk about AF2 today. When we planned that seminar, we thought that that would be a good idea to give you a bit of a recap of what was the situation since a couple of years, to the extent there have been many initiatives from ESMA and from the EU Commission. But today, our thoughts are that it's even more important than before to have that seminar, to the extent that we have that new retail investment strategy about which we will discuss today. Let me introduce you my panelists. On my immediate left, we have Nicolas Deldim, who is a partner of Arendt Regulatory Consulting. And in his left, we have David Majoub, who is a senior associate at the level of the firm. Welcome, both of you. And I will pass immediately the floor to Nicolas to give us a bit of an update on where we are today, what was the background, and where are we today in respect of that sensitive topic, I would say.
Thank you, Michelle. So, good afternoon, everybody. It all started with the introduction of the duty to prevent undue cost in funds that was introduced, for those who remember, in the Ucits 4 implementing directive and in the IFMD level 2 regulation. It came with little guidance from the regulator how to practically interpret and comply with that duty to prevent undue cost. And this is quite recently, well, some years ago, that there has been a number of actions at European level and discussions still taking place today in relation to cost and charges in funds. And it really started and kicked off with a supervisory briefing from ESMA, which basically was an instruction to regulators how to monitor their market and how IFMs should comply with that duty to prevent undue cost. So there has been a common supervisory action organized by ESMA, which has, of course, caused the CSSF in Luxembourg to basically undertake a number of actions for the Luxembourg market. You may have been participating in this. There has been a data collection. There has been investigation and cross questions on the market practice in IFMs in relation to undue cost. And finally, the CSSF published a report providing feedback on what is the current state of play in Luxembourg. We'll talk about that in 1 second. But I can't resist indicating, of course, already what's coming, because the Common Supervisory Action finds a perfect anchorage in that global retail investor strategy that we will briefly touch upon during this webinar. And you will notice that we start from regulatory principle, then come the logical level 3 supervision, and then we end up with a reinforced regulation potentially for the future. So this is the kind of pattern that we are now used to with the European legislation.
And that's a Rexit now. It enables me to make the link or the bridge with my next question, Nicolas, because you mentioned the CSSF report. And I wanted to ask you, what's the major concerns which have been highlighted by the CSSF?
Well, the report is basically factually revealing that the market was not really addressing in a proper manner the cost and charges in funds. The documentation around the pricing process was rather weak. Or there could have been some elements of procedure here and there, but there was no consolidated approach. The second point is that CSSF indicates the risk that there is an over-reliance on the delegated portfolio manager, which is often the fund initiator in relation to setting the cost level in the product. Probably a big point, the absence of periodic review. You establish a product and you don't come back on the cost framework to challenge whether this is still an acceptable cost framework. That is completed with a number of observations with our attention brought on the fact that regulators are looking after conflicts of interest potentially with related parties. So the big point of attention are there. And that report was the occasion for the CSSF to invite the market to basically start working in the definition of a formal pricing process, embedding an undue cost analysis of the cost frameworks in each strategy, and to implement an annual review process for the cost frameworks. But before that, maybe in the blue box, it's important to understand that the undue cost concept is larger than just the decision to
cost.
Yes, to define whether one cost item can be charged to the fund or not. It's larger than that, and it involves, for example, need to consider the investment objective and the characteristics of the fund. It must be linked, of course, to an added value delivered to the fund investor. It must be proportionate, which is a call for comparing the cost structure with peer funds. It must be sustainable, the cost framework, so to say, and organized according to the equal treatment of investors with strict respect of disclosure and transparency to investors. So I think it's much larger than just deciding what can be charged to the fund.
Okay, thank you. And David, what is the, let's say, context of that? Meaning that I understand that the CSSF may, of course, do on-site visits, but I understand also that the CSSF is raising directly questions to funds board. Is it correct? And what are really their positions in that respect of their questions? And what was the impact concretely of the, let's say, intervention of the CSSF?
Yes, well, the CSSF has a particular interest in funds with a high level of costs. And we know that this has been under great scrutiny from the CSSF lately. In March of this year, letters were sent by the CSSF to a number of management companies identifying funds which were deemed to have a very high level of costs, so above 3.5% of ongoing charges. And in these letters, the CSSF asked the management companies to provide a breakdown with specific information on what explains those high level of ongoing charges, and also requested to be provided with information regarding the remedial actions that should be undertaken to remedy the situation.
What do you mean by remedial actions?
The remedial actions, concretely, we know that some products have been liquidated.
At the request of the CSSF, or?
We know that it is as a result of these questions asked by the CSSF, and those were the remedial actions taken. Other remedial actions that were taken also were mergers, so products which had a very low level of assets under management, but a high level of costs and charges, ended up being merged into
at
other
the level
products.
of the sub-funds or the umbrella?
I don't think we have this level of detail. I assume it would be at sub-fund level.
Sub-funds level, yeah.
Yes. So besides that, we see that this heightened level of scrutiny on the part of the CSSF is also an evolution that we notice in the phase of the creation of new products. We have the usual forms and questionnaires that we need to submit to the CSSF. And now they include confirmations which are inspired directly by the ESMA Supervisory Briefing of 2020. We have the same type of questions in some reports to the CSSF. And also more generally, a general observation would be to observe that we're getting more and more questions from the CSSF, fee-related questions, which are linked to notably the ESMA Supervisory Briefing of 2020, especially if you intend to adjust the fee structure of a product, then you should expect to get questions and requests for confirmations from the CSSF on that. And I think that, Nicola, you have seen similar questions on the topic of algorithms.
Well, this is also all around fees in funds, but we have the typical questions, how fund managers should allocate the portion of fees between the portfolio manager and the investment advisor. It's
who advisor or not?
Yeah, exactly. So this is a recurring question. We also have questions in relation to, well, that's fairly new, I must say, but the CSSF is starting to look into these portfolio managers using quantitative algorithm and potentially have questions around the cost of running the algorithm and the royalties paid to third parties potentially if they are
the underlying
proportionate.
costs which are not necessarily quite visible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so well, this is a new topic, but we also have questions quite recently on the fee sharing arrangements on securities lending.
Which is not new, but
that's not new, but this is
focus,
fueled by the ESMA investigation and Common Supervisory Action. So there has been questions between regulators, and Luxembourg was part of it, and the CSSF had to, so to say, accelerate its supervision of the market in respect of securities lending fee allocation.
Okay. But guys, I have another question for you, because if you look at the trends, is there really a reason for the authorities to be a bit worried about the cost versus the performance of funds? What is really the driver of all that that initiative, I would say?
Well, it has probably started with, well, as far as I remember, years ago, there has been a closet tracker scandal with a lot of attention paid by regulators. Okay, well, we have funds which pretend to be actively managed, which are quite expensive for the funds, but actually they only track an index, so they have a passive behavior. And that was the start, as far as I remember, of all these discussions.
Yeah, right.
And over the last 5 or 6 years, we regularly see reports from European authorities in relation to the cost of retail products. And we should not forget that this is still the big ambition of the European regulator, is to ensure that retail investors participate in the capital markets. So we have spotted a number
in the context of the CMU.
Yes, we have spotted a number of interesting trends, and the first one on the screen is directly coming from an ESMA report in relation to cost in retail products, and it shows that over the last 10 years, the cost in fund products has constantly decreased, but the trend is even bigger for new products. I explained this by the fact that it's probably easier to create a new product with a cost framework that is more competitive than coming back on the contractual framework of an existing product and negotiate fees with all the stakeholders. So this is probably an explanation.
And they have decreased in reality.
They have decreased in reality, and basically it is also fueled by a very competitive landscape.
And David, we cannot speak about ESG funds because there has been some, let's say, rumors in the past that they were less performing than the other ones. Is it still true, pursuant to the data we have, or not?
Oh, according to the data we have, actually ESG funds are cheaper and better performing than their non-ESG peers. And this may seem a bit counterintuitive when you take into account the fact that these ESG funds need ESG-related data that they will use in their investment process, but this comes with a cost. And so there are several factors which explain how ESG funds can still manage to be cheaper. One of the factors is the fact that they tend to be more heavily oriented towards developed market and large caps, because it's easier to get data-related information from this type of market. And this type of market is associated with lower cost than, for instance, emerging markets or small caps. But even when you control for these factors, ESG funds still manage to be cheaper and perform better than their non-ESG peers.
Good to know, but I believe, Nicolas, there might be another elephant in the room, I guess, because the retail investment strategy paper, not really clearly, but in between the lines, mention, let's say, passive funds versus active funds. What could you say about it?
Well, that's true that each time you talk about cost in funds with anybody, the question of the exchange traded funds come on the table, because they have the reputation to be absolutely cheap compared to actively managed funds. And if you talk about costs, you can't resist comparing the two kind of products. And this is a trend that we cannot disregard as a fund industry. That ETFs are collecting massively money from investors. So the graph on the right side on the top is showing a tremendous trend for collecting money in ETFs. And it's also in connection with something that is an interesting development, is the connection that the ESMA is making with the development of the new broker platforms, which are digital platforms allowing people to subscribe in exchange traded funds via their mobile phone. So this is corresponding to maybe a shift in the distribution model, or at least a shift in the kind of investors and their needs when they start investing money. So this is a trend that is there. We have to take this into consideration, but the question is, do we really have to oppose ETFs versus actively managed funds, especially because we have portfolio managers using both to complement adequately the needs of the client. So,
and you still believe they are complementary?
Well, it all depends what is the need of one client. As ESMA has repeated several times, the value is not just a cost aspect. You have to consider many different things, and it's not just an easy shortcut, of course.
But you make my life easy, because it enables me to make the bridge with the next topic, which is really, what is value for money? What is the value for money concept? It does exist already in the UK. Is the intention of the EU Commission to apply the same throughout Europe, or do they have other considerations?
Well, that's true that the concept of value for money is forming an inherent part of this retail investor strategy that is discussed since several years at European level. Well, the concept is fairly simple. Value for money simply means that investment products should have some utility for investors, and investment products should be well designed and cost efficient, so that the investor will benefit from the highest performance possible. So that's where I see a big connection, of course, with the cost, because cost is an important factor in that cost efficiency concept. And in that respect, ESMA has been taking several actions since several years. So we see this coming from quite a while now. The value for money concept will be concretely implemented in the retail investor strategy omnibus directive we will present in a couple of seconds.
But more broadly, Nicolas, what is it about, the retail investment strategy paper?
Well, the retail investor strategy paper is the idea that it's critical for Europe to ensure that retail clients have trust in the financial sector and invest their savings into products and services offered by the financial sector. And what is the plan is to modify a number of different siloed directives so far. So this is an omnibus directive. On one side, modifying the Ucits and the IFM directive, modifying MiFID, modifying the insurance distribution directive and the PRIPS regulation, so that this is happening concretely. So that plan to reconnect with the retail investors and the financial sector. So, but if we focus on the changes to the Ucits and IFM directives, this is where we see a kind of transposition into a level 1 directive, the kind of recommendation that ESMA delivered in the supervisory briefings, but it brings additional things which I think is very important for the market to keep in mind or to keep.
Sorry to interrupt you, but then it means that the Ucits and the AFMD will be changed as a consequence of that omnibus directive.
Well, that's the plan, but there have been other parallel discussions to modify the Ucits and the IFMD, again with elements around the duty to prevent and due cost and the cost levels in funds. But what
I raise the point because there are already some modifications planned.
So that's true that we have different level of discussions here, but the rumor, or so to say, the rumor, what people think is that it's likely to come anyway, sooner rather than very late.
Meaning before the omnibus directive is voted.
Potentially,
or applicable.
Yes, we have little clarity there, but this is what people expect. So that's important to keep that on the table. What I think is an important point is that the retail investor strategy package is bringing important things which may have an impact on one side on the level of cost in funds, of course, but also on the fund distribution. There has been a webinar on that already. But the idea is that if the value for money concept is also applicable at the level of the point of sale, the idea is to ensure that you have no offering of investment product that is biased by inducement, for example, and this is coming with additional MiFID restrictions, and the duty to, when you deliver advice to retail clients, your duty would be to advise cost-efficient product with that concept of value for money product. So this is something that is transversal and touching the entire value chain, affecting the manufacturers and the distributors. So very important regulatory piece according.
And to be clear, I understand that may trigger changes to the PRIPS, let's say, regulation, which means that players will have again to modify the content of their PRIPS.
Yes, that's the plan.
That will be really welcomed by the market.
That's the plan. And of course, as you industrialize the production of the kit, this is again...
I was more talking about costs to do it.
Yeah, oh, yeah, of course, it's all connected.
Just to link that with the subject in question.
But it's potentially important to come back on the definition of undue cost, because that's true that that's a contribution of the retail investor strategy package, that regulators were in difficulty to enforce the duty to prevent undue cost because there was an absence of proper definition. And maybe, David, you can explain to us the...
Yes, of course, yeah. Thank you, Nicolas. Well, yes, currently you have at level 2, Ucits level 2, you have an obligation for management companies to ensure that their funds will not be charged any undue costs. However, you don't have a definition that can help the management company assess whether a cost is due or not. And here what we have, and it's an important amendment, is the introduction of a definition of undue cost using 3 criteria. So if a cost to be due, we'll have to ensure that it meets those 3 criteria. The first one being the fact that it complies with the prospectus and key disclosures. The second one being that it should be a cost which is necessary for the fund to operate in line with its investment policy or to comply with regulatory requirements. such as complying with amendments to the PRIIPs regulation. And you have the third requirement, which is the fact that it needs to be ensured that the manner in which the costs are borne ensure the fair treatment of investors. And so, as Nicolas pointed out, this addresses a concern that was raised by national competent authorities during the Common Supervisory Action regarding the fact that there was a lack of specificity in the provision regarding the prevention of undue cost, and therefore lack of a strong legal basis for national competent authorities to identify clear-cut breaches and take action.
Okay, and you mentioned also that the whole exercise may, let's say, imply a white list of eligible costs. Is it correct? A bit like what does exist, if my understanding is correct, in the UK. They have a blacklist. We will have a white list.
Well, yes, this is something which was mentioned in the ESMA's opinion on undue costs, and everything seems to converge towards a solution that would be using a list of costs, which is included in Part 1 of Annex 6 to the PRIIPs regulation. And so ESMA would come up with regulatory technical standards to specify, depending on the type of product and its investment policy, which costs among the list are eligible and which are not. And then there would be maybe additional criteria on the basis of which you could get an authorization for additional costs which are not included in the list, but that would be on a case-by-case basis.
Authorization from the national authorities. Yeah. Okay, then let's go to another sensitive topic. Nicolas, you mentioned earlier that it's already required by the NDA, the national authorities, to put in place a structured pricing process at the level of the IFM. Let us know a bit more about what is an ideal, let's say, pricing process.
Well, at least the pricing process, the way it is described in the Retail Investor Omnibus Directive, is a policy document that should be periodically reviewed, but that is providing an overview of what is done by the IFM to ensure cost framework in funds are due and legitimate. And that policy document is supposed to allocate responsibilities among the stakeholders of the firm and define the precise role and the involvement of the management body in respect of the cost framework. So we should see a kind of a validation process engaging the governing bodies of the IFMs. And the pricing process is based on the fact that an IFM should conduct an undue cost analysis, document it, and that analysis should provide for the identification of the cost, a proper quantification, and a justification in relation to those criteria that I already mentioned, because it's very, very consistent with the supervisory briefing of ESMA. What is a little bit different is the fact that the Retail Investor Strategy Directive is coming with the idea that there should be a comparison of the cost framework of a fund with a benchmark, and that benchmark in the future will be published by ESMA directly. So this is fueling a lot of discussions in respect of it. Because
for whichever type of strategy?
Well,
for whichever type of asset allocation?
It does not mention anything, but
Okay.
today what we see is that asset managers are basically downloading data from peer groups or investigating which kind of product can compare with their products. But in the future, the idea would be to compare with the benchmark released directly by the regulator, and this is raising a lot of criticism from the industry because this is a big change.
But is it realistic for ESMA to issue a single benchmark per type of strategy or asset allocation or proprietary strategies? I cannot imagine that.
Well,
what's the plan there?
Well, the plan would be to collect information from the market and then to elaborate ranges per categories of financial instruments. So for financial strategies, sorry. And of course, the market is a bit worried about the fact that this could be too simplistic, but we come to this we have put together a number of questions around the benchmarking process, which is obviously a very important change that the entire industry should look at.
Yeah, indeed. And Nicola, you also mentioned that, of course, IFM should have a structured pricing process, but which should be reassessed annually. And what's the consequence if during that assessment, the IFM just notes, let's say, some undue costs or costs which are maybe higher as compared to what they should be? What's the consequence of that?
Yes, that's something that is that came as a surprise because this was not addressed by the Common Supervisory Action so far, but the Retail Investment Strategy Omnibus Directive introduced the duty to potentially reimburse and compensate investors in case undue costs have been identified. So the idea would be that you make your annual assessment, you discover that undue costs have been charged to the investors, and then it means the IFM will have to report the kind of breach to the IFM home member state, the fund home member state, and the fund depository. So informing the key stakeholders and the regulators, and put into place a process, of course, that will provides for the compensation of the investors. And according to the discussions...
a process similar to the one which is in place for breaches or any errors?
Precisely.
Similar 0277 or?
Exactly. As we were discussing this point with the CSSF, this is probably what they have in mind. So something like that.
Just the CSSF or the EU member states or authorities?
I guess this is... that kind of 0277 process is existing in Luxembourg since ever, but it's not the same case in all member states. We know that. But the idea, at least for the CSSF, is that it makes sense to obey to the same kind of mechanism.
And I hope it will be implemented in the same way in other member states, or it should probably. We should.
Ideally.
Have an harmonized position, I would say, among regulators in that respect. Okay, thanks a lot. And then, Nicola, another question from you, because you talk about benchmarks, which will be, let's say, imposed by ESMA. And what happens if we note a deviation from the benchmark?
Well, that's the critical point, is that on the basis of the reporting and data escalated from the industry to the national competent authorities, there will be a centralization at the European level. They already have quite some data, because if you read the reports on cost and charges in retail products, they base themselves on many statistics and figures and data. But the idea is that they publish a benchmark, which would be probably a range. And if you compare yourself with that benchmark, and that you deviate from it, if you can't justify why you deviate from the benchmark, you will be potentially subject to a prohibition to market to retail investors. So one interesting point is that...
Because the cost will be too high?
Because it will not be cost efficient in the concept. This is connected with the value for money concept. Interestingly, in the MiFID directive, for example, you have similar reporting obligations in relation to the cost of selling the products. And so we can see that distribution cost is explicitly mentioned to be reported by MiFID firms to the regulators, so they will see or better understand what is the cost of distribution within the product, which I think is one big element of the cost items in the cost framework of actively managed funds.
And I guess that creates a lot of, let's say, uncertainties from the market or concerns. What's the current feedback from the market?
Yes,
David.
Well, the first is what you mentioned in terms of feasibility. Is it feasible to really come up with benchmarks that will cover the wide diversity of funds that we have in a very close and corresponding way? This is a question for which we do not have an answer. There is also a question which is tied to this. It's how specific will the benchmark be? Will we have like general benchmarks or very specific benchmarks which are tailored to very specific types of products? There is also some criticism on the part of different market players because this proposal seems to be very cost-oriented, maybe a bit one-dimensional, and maybe there is not enough emphasis put on other extra financial considerations which may bring value to investors, such as ESG. So we need to see what it is going to be like in this respect.
Or other factors which are included in the value for money concept in the UK. If my recollection is correct, value for money is comprised of 7 specific criteria, one of which is cost, of course, but there are plenty of other ones, I would say.
Yes.
Well, the big risk would be that the granularity for the benchmark construction is not there, and that you would mix up with products which you don't think compare with your investment strategy, of course. And
granularity will be difficult to achieve, I guess.
And one question which is also related to that is, will the activeness or the passiveness of the funds be taken into account in designing the benchmarks? And so this is not something which is, let's say, obvious for now. There is no certainty.
From the paper, you mean?
From the paper, yeah. We can think, taking into account the criteria that need to be considered in the assessment of the proportionality of costs, which include the investment policy and the investment strategy, we could think that this is a feature, passive or active, which would, at least it would make sense to take it into account in developing the benchmarks. But there is no certainty on that topic for now either. So.
Okay, and at which frequency should we do that assessment? Should it be annually? Should it be ongoing? What's the plan there?
Well, the plan is to at least do that annually, but will you wait for the end of the year for...
If you know something's wrong.
Yes, if something is wrong, you want to anticipate what could be the impact on the product, so we can imagine that people will have early alert mechanisms or more regular consideration in relation to the cost level in their product.
Okay, thanks a lot. I believe we come at the end, let's say, of the presentation, but before we close, I wanted maybe to check with our IT whether we have questions from the audience. In that respect, let me double check rapidly whether we have some questions. Yes, there is one question which is easy to understand, I guess. You mentioned, David, a 3.5% maximum of TER for Ucits funds, if my recollection is correct. Where does it come from? That's the question of one person from the audience.
Yeah, so it's the 3.5%. It was the level mentioned in the letters sent to management companies, and above which the level of fees considered to be very high. And so we understand that this initiative comes from the teams within the CSSF in charge of the supervision of funds, and that it's based on data which is publicly available data or data taken from periodic reportings as well. So,
meaning that it's not applied across Europe. That's Luxembourg-specific requirement.
But yeah, based on our discussions with the CSSF, that's what we understood, that they have this at Luxembourg level.
Based on the ESMA guidelines, but put in place by the CSSF and probably to be followed by other NCAs, I guess. Huh?
Yeah, well, what you can read in
For products which are distributed across Europe, it may make sense.
what you can read as well in the press, if you are at that level of fees, you are
high.
You are very expensive.
You are high indeed. Huh? Then we have another question from the audience. Are you aware of any common market practice or trends among MANCOs or AFM regarding the content of the structure pricing process? Maybe for you, Nicolas?
The content of the pricing process. Well, at first, when the CSSF released its communiqué, asking IFMs to put in place a pricing process, our observation was that it was going in all directions. Recently, we had a conversation with the CSSF, which, however, have seen a progression or a convergence in the understanding of what should be in the pricing process, especially in respect of the establishment of a cost framework for a new product. What was rather diverging, according to the CSSF, is what IFMs put in place in terms of annual review and who is involved, the stakeholders contributing to the periodical review. That's kind of divergent approach depending on the asset manager, and some are using data that they buy from data vendors, others are doing differently, and this is still not very consistent. It does not need to be consistent, but at least that's an observation that the pricing process starts to be very different.
But did you see already some sanctions given to players in case no pricing process exists, or?
According to what we have understood from the CSSF, they don't see themselves as a sanctioning body here, but rather as a body encouraging the market to take the right direction, especially in consideration of what's developing at European level. And so for the moment, we have not heard about sanctions except potentially more difficult discussions with too expensive funds and the consequences for some of them.
Meaning too expensive beyond the 3.5% threshold?
Yes, beyond, or posing obvious questions of viability, because the cost structure is actually eating the entire performance of the product. So this is really, of course, is related to the performance of the fund. But no, the CSSF has not raised particular sanctions at this stage. It is, however, possible that if the CSSF pays a visit to the market and that nothing has been done, this will be hard to explain, right?
And do you see a huge impact in terms of revisiting the distribution, let's say, channels for particular funds, in particular for Ucits, of course?
Well, it raises the questions if this has been spotted, that the distribution cost, the cost for distributing a product, is an important cost factor in the cost framework of an actively managed fund, and that it may generate BAs in the offering of the products, which is particularly the point that the regulator wants to address. We have to imagine that those sum of restrictions altogether will force people to be creative and find alternative way to sell their products to their clients. And
you talk about trader fees, which should be
well, this is exactly the question.
Replaced by something else.
The trader fee model is again on the table under the focus, and clearly the market will have to find ways to adapt and potentially do without trader fees, or find another approach that would be still compliant.
To think about it. And I believe we still have 1 minute, then time may be rapidly for one question. Someone from the audience asked whether, due to the fact that the Ucits directive and the AFMD will soon or not, let's say, incorporate new requirements regarding fees and costs, is it better maybe to anticipate that and to take concrete actions in that respect? We discussed that a bit already. Huh?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that it's very important to know where you are and where your product range is in terms of fee levels. If you run a risk to be criticized or receive complaints in that respect, I think that's exactly the kind of questions the CSSF, by the way, is raising. Have you received complaints with your high expensive product? So this is certainly posing the questions: is my entire product range efficient and competitive? So that's yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot for your contribution, guys. I hope it has been really helpful for the audience. I have a lot of other questions on my screen, but I believe we have no time. But we will come back to you in any way, rapidly in writing, with some answer to your questions, just not to disappoint you. We will come back to you and feel free to address further questions, and we'll also be pleased to come back to you for these additional questions afterwards. Thanks a lot to the audience for your attention today, and we hope to see you also soon at the next Ucits webinar. Thanks a lot, and have a nice day. Have a nice week.